I'm aware that this is unconventional. Believe me, I've tried conventional. It didn't end well for anyone. I require a certain open-mindedness that I'm hoping I might find here. But, more importantly, I need my future husband to know the rules. Meet cutes are well and good on the screen, but they don't guarantee a partner's ability to follow basic instructions. That was my mistake the first time. So, begging your pardon for my bluntness, I'm going to be clear about my requirements. Please, listen carefully. If you can't meet them, there's no point in going any further. Must want children. At least one child, anyway. I'm open to the idea of more, but one is an absolute must. Must be in it for the long haul. Until our child turns 18, to be precise. I understand that level of commitment is a daunting prospect, particularly when we have not yet met. After our child is born, you are welcome to ignore me, if you please, or take your pleasure elsewhere. Though, I will warn you that it might be difficult to come by. But you will live under my roof until our child is an adult. Homebody preferred. It will make the next 2 decades easier on you. Must have impeccable manners. I will provide a manual outlining the required etiquette, but you must at least have a grasp of basic courtesy to begin with. If you let your tongue run away with you, or don't bother to wish your neighbors a good morning when you pass them in the street, you can stop listening right now. This is not the opportunity for you. Seriously. This is the part where I should talk about myself. But let's face it, this is hardly a romantic proposal. I require commitment up front, and there's no guarantee that, once we do meet, we'll really even like each other. If we do, fantastic. It'll help the years fly by. If we don't, you'll still have the main prize. Years of rent-free, expenses-free living at the Old Oak Hotel. A sanctuary has stood in this spot in one form or another since before the ley lines. During its tenure, it has been flooded, put to the flame, and pounded into dust. Time and again it has been reimagined and rebuilt. Most of the current building dates back to Victoria's reign, though the oldest parts were constructed in the 13th century. At the very bottom of the garden, cut into the surrounding hills, there is a cave bearing handprints of red ochre. There has always been an Edwards at the hotel, though, of course, we haven't always gone by that name. You would think a family so tied to one place would do a better job of keeping records, but no one is certain of our origins. Perhaps it was a cosmic bargain, or perhaps mere luck. Whether good or bad, I have never been able to decide. Either way, our presence is required. Throughout our spotty past, there's a story here and there of an Edwards deserting their post, and it always coincides with a particularly brutal period of history. I inherited this position 5 years ago. At midnight on my 18th birthday, my parents took their already packed suitcases and left. I don't blame them for their abandonment. I intend to one day do the same thing to my, or hopefully our, child. They send me postcards and photos from time to time, always smiling on sunny beaches. Money isn't a concern for them. That's part of whatever mysterious deal our ancestors made. When a caretaker leaves in good standing, they will never want for anything again. They could travel the world for the rest of their lives, always sleeping in the softest sheets and dining in the finest restaurants, and never find their pockets empty. Keep this point in mind, for if you can meet my requirements, you will share my good fortune. And what must we do in return? I can all but hear you screaming the question. Why, very little. The presence of an Edwards ensures that the guests can't stray from the hotel grounds. Most of our guests are live-in residents, though we do get the occasional walk-in. Where they come from, I don't know, for we are not visible to most people who stumble upon our lonely corner of the world. I've come to believe the hotel chooses to reveal itself when it's lacking entertainment, or to fill a need. Jimmy, my first husband, was one such guest. For most part, the guests are harmless. They'll give you a little fright from time to time, popping out from a wall or turning your bathwater into blood. But I find it hard to hold it against them. I found 23 years here dreary. I can't imagine how bored I would be after 500. There are a few exceptions you should be aware of. Eric, our residential serial murderer. He claims to have been Jack the Ripper while he still drew breath, but I think he's just a blowhard. He knows better than to harm an Edwards, but I'm afraid spouses are fair game. Years ago, my grandmother managed to confine him to the 4th floor. So, you will be perfectly safe from him as long as you never set foot there. Occasionally, the lift will stop on that floor, even though you haven't pressed the button for it. Do not get out. Even if the lift appears to be on fire, or starts filling with murky water, wait for the doors to close again, then go to another floor. It should only take a few hours. The thing in the cellar. I don't know what it is. No one ever has. We only know it eats rats and must be fed once a day. If I'm ever ill or incapacitated, this task will fall to you. Harvest the rats from the traps in the garden, then stand at the cellar door and throw them down the stairs. Do not walk down the stairs, and do not forget to feed it. You don't want to be the first person to see its face. Mrs. Jones. Old-fashioned and a stickler for manners. She's the reason I'm advertising for a husband, rather than a boyfriend. She won't abide a couple living in sin under the same roof as her. Really, though, she's a sweet old thing, full of stories about the war, and always ready to help if I get stuck on a recipe. I don't blame her for what happened with Jimmy at all. I'd warned him enough times. Guests aside, there are other rules you will need to follow to ensure a safe, satisfactory stay at the Old Oak Hotel. They are listed in a book that has been repenned many times over the centuries. If you choose to accept this opportunity, I will insist that you read it until you can recite the pages word for word. However, there are some rules so critical for your survival that I feel compelled to list them here. With the exception of the 4th floor, you are welcome to roam the hotel and its grounds as you please, but you must never set foot outside of our land. Not until our child is old enough to fulfill their duties. If I were to do so, it would unleash pandemonium, plague, peril, perhaps another world war. I'm afraid you would be less crucial to the fate of the world, but it would certainly be a personal disaster. Never look in the mirrors in room 33. And I've touched on this point already, but it bears repeating. Never be rude to Mrs. Jones. Failure to observe that last rule is what got Jimmy. She doted on him. I think he reminded her of her long-dead son, for she pampered him as if he were one of her own. Each morning, she had breakfast ready for him before I had so much as opened my eyes, and she developed a habit of trailing along after him, complimenting his skill as he oiled rusted hinges or set a crooked picture straight. At first, Jimmy basked in the attention, but by the end of his 2nd month, he was growing bored of Mrs. Jones, me, and the hotel itself. We pride ourselves in our facilities. If you need more activity than a turn around the garden, we have a lovely indoor pool. It freezes over every now and then, but most of the time it's perfectly usable. Our library is unmatched. Although the room is cramped, it has every book imaginable. You only need to think of a particular title, and it will appear on one of the shelves. And now that I've dragged us kicking and screaming into the 21st century, we have a wide array of streaming services. It wasn't enough for Jimmy. He wanted to go out, eat in a restaurant, watch a film in the cinema, see any faces other than the ones he was surrounded by every day. He began having a drink each evening. One drink turned into several, and after a few weeks, the bar became his permanent residence between dusk and midnight. He wasn't the only one getting bored. I had been thrilled when he first arrived, ecstatic when he agreed to stay. How marvelous to feel real flesh beneath my fingers after 5 years of only the dead for company. What a relief to have some assistance in the many tasks required to keep the hotel running as it should. The more he drank, the less inclined he was to help, or even spend time in my company. He no longer visited my bed, choosing a room for himself on the opposite end of the floor. When our paths did cross, at best he would ignore me. At worst, he would nitpick or outright rail against me, blaming me for his captivity. Still, I made an effort to be present whenever he frequented the bar. As lovely as Mrs. Jones can be, she does have a tendency to nag. Before and after her death, she was close to teetotal, only consenting to take a single sherry at Christmas, and drinking outside of special occasions is something of a bugbear of hers. "Think of your health, dear," she would tell Jimmy brusquely. "You'll miss it when it's gone." Or, "How about we switch to a nice apple juice now? You've had quite enough to drink for one night." Most of the time, Jimmy managed to pull himself together enough to flash a charming smile and distract her with a compliment about her latest meal. But after one too many drink, I'd noticed him gritting his teeth and just barely managing to hold his tongue. It was better if I was present. Playing the doting wife, I insisted on pouring his drinks, watering them down out of his sight. When Mrs. Jones' nagging bordered on relentless, I could always distract her with a game of gin rummy. On his final day, I was running behind. The ghoul on the second floor, usually the least demanding of our guests, had come down with some dreadful illness, or else decided he wanted to inconvenience me. Either way, I had woken that morning to the foulest stench I had ever experienced. I followed it to his room and found every surface covered in putrid, green-black gunge, its consistency somewhere between mucus and vomit. All day I scrubbed, taking only brief breaks to step outside before I fainted. By the time the room was restored to a passable state, and I had filled several bin bags to bursting with filthy rags, it was already deep into the night. Mindful of the time, I paused only long enough to wash the streaks of muck from my arms and face before racing to the bar. I arrived just in time to hear Jimmy's last words. After he spat them at Mrs. Jones, she only stared for a small eternity, her mouth frozen in the motherly smile she wore whenever she scolded him. Then, like melted wax, her face began to shift. I shouted at Jimmy to run, but he didn't need to be told. Before the words left my mouth, he leapt from his bar stool and streaked through the door. Mrs. Jones followed him seconds later. Her lips were already peeling back to reveal rows upon rows of long, wickedly sharp fangs, while claws sprouted from beneath her lace-edged cuffs. I sprinted after them, but Jimmy was fueled by fear, and Mrs. Jones by whatever force propels the Mrs. Joneses of the world. I followed the screeching to the lobby. Breathless, I arrived to see he had arrived within mere feet of the entrance before Mrs. Jones grabbed him. Claws wrapped around his throat, she lifted him into the air. As I watched, her jaw unhinged, the lower part dropping so that it was nearly level with her chest. That sight drove all the sense out of my head, forgetting every rule my parents had ever drilled into me. I lunged at her. She battered me away as though I weighed no more than a fly. I crashed into the reception desk, the breath bursting from my lungs in a great whoosh. I was certain that I would die, for no amount of effort seemed to force air back into my aching chest. At last, as my vision began to dim, I managed to take a small gulp, then another, and another, until I was able to draw myself together enough to regain my feet. By that time, Mrs. Jones had nearly finished her dinner. Jimmy's chest was splayed open, muscle and shattered ribs protruding every which way from his flesh, and she was devouring the last few bites of his heart. His head was angled towards me. The light had winked out from his eyes, but they still held his final terror, and an accusation which, I was quite certain, was directed at me. I would like to say I felt only horror, but I couldn't help my sudden jolt of irritation. How many times had I told him to mind his manners? Mrs. Jones gulped, the sound thick and wet in her gullet, and dropped what remained of Jimmy to the floor. Then, she turned to me. Here's another rule for you. One which I hope you never have cause to use. Never interfere with a kill. The Mrs. Jones who used to kiss my grazed knees, who argued with my mother for the right to read me bedtime stories, was no longer at the wheel. No amount of pleading or reasoning would move her. I could only run. Spinning around, I vaulted over the reception desk and raced for the office behind it. If Jimmy had not been out of his mind with fear and booze, he might have remembered the rules and survived. It was one of the several staff-only rooms throughout the hotel, warded to keep out unwanted guests. Just 10 steps from desk to door. Yet, it was the longest journey of my life. My hard-won breath burned my throat. My heart pounded in my ears, deafening me to all other sounds than Mrs. Jones' heavy, pounding footsteps. Grasping the handle, her hot, copper-tanged breath was on my neck. Fire exploded in my flesh as she raked her claws down my back. A step further away, and I wouldn't have made it. The pain would have been too great. But I managed to throw myself into the office and slam the door before crumpling to the ground. Before I passed out, I heard her grunting and shrieking outside, furious that she couldn't get in. 3 days I spent in the office, emerging only to feed the thing in the cellar before scurrying back to my hiding place. Whenever I left, I tried not to look at the mangled heap that used to be Jimmy. There was no avoiding the smell, though. With no small difficulty, and the help of a first aid kit, I managed to treat and bandage the wounds on my back. They bled sluggishly all throughout the first day, but thankfully didn't fester. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a tentative knock on the door, followed by the sound of rapidly retreating footsteps. I waited until they had disappeared down the corridor before cracking the door open. On the floor was a freshly baked Victoria sponge and a beautifully written note of apology. It took every ounce of courage I possessed, but that evening I forced myself to go to the dining room. Mrs. Jones was waiting for me, her eyes red-rimmed, a steaming cottage pie on the table. I tried not to flinch as she took my hand, reiterating the apology she had already delivered in writing. The next morning, she helped me clean Jimmy up. We treated each other cautiously for a while, but eventually we got back to playing gin rummy again. When the scars on my back twinge, as they sometimes do, she helps me rub a soothing ointment into them. Even though I've told her it's not necessary, she apologizes every time. So, you've heard my story, and you have my proposal. If you think you could be the man for me, I invite you to visit. You'll need to drink a cup of ram's blood. A pinch of nutmeg makes it a little more tolerable, and light a black candle before bedtime. When you next wake, you will find yourself at our gates. As travel arrangements go, it's hardly the Orient Express, but it beats the airfare. If you have listened to this without flinching, if you can stomach the journey to get here, if you walk up to our door and find the nerve to open it, I have one more instruction for you. Just as you enter, look to your right. You'll see a deep brown stain on the lobby carpet. I've scrubbed and scrubbed, but it just won't come out. Perhaps that's for the best. It's a good reminder of what will happen to you should you call Mrs. Jones a nosy old bat. And when you run into Jimmy, as you will, for he still likes hanging around the bar in the evening, his silvery wounds glistening as though they had just been inflicted, don't let him convince you he was some sort of victim. He knew the rules. Okay. So, let me explain. I swear it wasn't me who put it there. So, I go on Craigslist, looking for a new sofa, because my roommate just moved out and took all his furniture, leaving me with only a couple of chairs pushed together. Like a makeshift couch. Whoever told me this life hack, by the way, I hope you suffer the same horrifically sore butt as mine. I found a sofa on sale. Decent price. The woman selling it, Sarah, tells me that she inherited her grandmother's house and is basically trying to just offload stuff. Asked if I want to see the other furniture. So, I also get a couple of new chairs, because fuck my old set that I hate now ever since using it as a couch. There's also a chest freezer she offers to throw in for a good deal, because she has no space for it. I don't need a chest freezer, but I think about how many pizzas I can fit into that sucker, and how many trips this will save me to the grocery store. You could fit a whole deer in this thing. It has a strange dent in the side and doesn't latch properly, and has this weird musty smell. But I plug it in and test it out, and it's working just fine. I don't have enough room in the Lowe's rental truck though, for the sofa, chairs, and this monstrosity. She tells me her cousin has a pickup, and can drop it off later since I'm local. Fast forward a few hours. There's a knock on my door. A burly guy and his buddy are there, and they tell me they have my freezer and carry it down to the unfurnished basement for me. I go to the store and buy 24 pizzas. Fuck yeah. And of course, beer. Getting home, I throw the beers in the fridge. Then stack as many pizzas as I can carry into my arms and bring them down to the basement and set them down and open the freezer. Then I shut the freezer. No way, says my brain. I can't actually process it. Not at first. Just doesn't compute. Because I looked in this freezer not a few hours earlier. Just this morning, right? Then I open it and peek again. There is a body in the freezer. Every hair on my neck stands on end. The gears of my brain grind, like a machine breaking down. Like there's a stick caught in the spokes. Only the stick is this mummified corpse. Certainly there was no shriveled corpse when I looked inside this morning. I would have remembered, I think. I giggle. Yes, I would have remembered a body. Hard to forget that sort of detail. Get it together, I tell myself. And then I ask myself, am I sure it's real? Half of me wants to shut the freezer and call the cops. The other half says that, no, I should investigate closer. I spend a full minute paralyzed between these two insanely bad options. Of course, there are no good options when you're dealing with a body in your newly purchased freezer. Finally, I decide the body must be a prank. A stunt. Oh, Sarah. So funny. What a riot. You got me. Pushing the lid all the way open, I lean over the corpse. And now the odor hits me. An old, musty odor. A stench. This body is not fresh. No. It looks like it's been around a while. Practically mummified. It's a man? Woman? With the shriveled skin, it's hard to tell. It's all dried out and discolored. The skin of the lips pulled back over yellowing teeth. Dressed in dirty clothes, spattered with old blood. It has strangely long fingernails. Makes me think of something I read once, truth or urban legend, about how the nails of the dead continue to grow after they've passed on. It also looks extremely lifelike. Well, you know what I mean. Realistically death-like. Not a Halloween prop. It occurs to me if this is a murder victim, I should search for an ID. But also, this is when the terror kicks in. And fuck no, I think, and shut the freezer. I still have all those pizzas. What the hell am I supposed to do with 24 thawing pizzas? And a corpse? So, the obvious thing to do here would be to call the police. But that's assuming you're a law-abiding citizen with no criminal record. Unfortunately, I hung with the wrong crowd when I was young. Took a ride in the back seats of a few stolen cars. Got in a few fights. Stupid stuff. And I regret it all now. I haven't done anything illegal in years. But would the cops recognize my good behavior? Or just my record? How would I even explain? Hello, officers. I bought a freezer and it came with a body inside. I mean, yes. I guess that's what I'd say. It is the truth. And I am innocent. But do I have faith that my innocence would keep me safe in America's justice system? Huh. Come on. So, instead, I decide I'll drive this fucking freezer straight back to Sarah's and dump it on her property, right where I found it. It's too heavy for me to move alone. After some calls, I convinced my former roommate to lend a hand. I don't plan to let him look in the freezer during the move. I resecure the latch and add a padlock. I'll remove it and my fingerprints once we bring it back. The rental truck isn't available until tomorrow, since Lowe's is already closed for the night. Which is fine. I need a cold place to keep those pizzas anyway. By midnight, I'm feeling like a fool for not calling the police. But also, I envision myself being thrown into a prison for a decade or more, for a crime I didn't commit. Whose body even is it? How did it get there? Why are the nails so long? All questions that haunt me beyond any hope of sleep. And finally, I get up and head down to the basement to grab one of those pizzas. And yes, it's scary as shit, going down there at midnight. I tell myself I'm a grown-ass adult, and there's nothing to be scared of. It's just a basement. Just a freezer. Just a corpse, like in a coffin at a wake. Like at any funeral. Natural as worm food. I try to make myself less scared of said corpse by telling myself it's just a mummy. The lamest of all movie monsters. Really, I just want to make sure it's still there, and that it's not moving around. Approaching the freezer, I take a deep breath. My heart is going 1,000,000 beats a minute. I feel like I might faint as I open the lid. Mummified body. Pizzas. My fluttering heart slowly settles. It's like looking into a sarcophagus at a museum, but next to Tutankhamun is a box of pizza. I grab a box, close the lid. The lid won't latch. It's not closing all the way. I try to figure out what's stuck, and then see the finger. The long nail sticking out from the freezer door like King Tut here, wants out. The breath leaves my body. I stare, unable to get in any oxygen. The whole world tilts on its axis. Then I open the lid, just a fraction. Use my pizza box to nudge the shriveled finger back in. Close the lid and latch it. Slip the padlock on and head upstairs. I wake up in the morning with my head pounding from a hangover. The bright sunshine pries my lids open. I'm surprised to find crumbs and empty beer cans beside my bed. Apparently, I actually cooked and ate that pizza. I crawled out of bed and meander into my kitchen, reaching for the fridge door, only to find the fridge in the wrong place. Oh. It seems in my terror, I moved it in front of the basement door. I move it back, and try to ignore my accelerating pulse as I open the basement door and cautiously peek down the stairs. Light from the windows illuminate the unfurnished cement flooring. From here, everything appears normal, though my pulse skyrockets as I pad downstairs and peek at the chest freezer. It is locked. Nothing is out of place. I think about unlocking it and looking at the mummy. Maybe getting my pizzas out before moving the freezer, but no. Fuck the pizzas. I leave it alone. It's been a few hours since my old roommate and I dropped off the chest freezer back at Sarah's property. I'm back home now, sitting on my sofa, recording this, and I keep thinking of that finger, with those long nails that clearly kept growing after death. Thinking of whether I need to reevaluate my stance on life and death and undeath, or whether I just dreamt the whole thing up, or I just don't know. But I wish I'd never bought those pizzas. If I hadn't ever put them in my freezer, I could pretend it was all just a bad dream. But I can't. Because as we were leaving, I remembered to take my padlock and wipe down the freezer. I remembered, too, the pizzas inside. And it occurred to me that someone might wonder who put those boxes in there, and better to take those too. My roommate helped me carry them, wrinkling his nose and saying, "Ugh, good call to return it. That freezer smells nasty." And now I keep imagining I hear shuffling down below in my basement, and I'm terrified to go down and look, because the freezer was definitely padlocked closed when we moved it. But when we opened it up at Sarah's property, there was no body lying there like a mummy in its sarcophagus. There were only pizzas, and caught in the hinge of the freezer door, one long, claw-like broken nail. So now, I have to wonder, where the fuck did the body go? Hey, remember the time you were 3 and almost burnt your hand when you touched the ironing machine? My mum says while chopping tomatoes for dinner. Yeah, I was pretty stupid back then, I say, while I iron her clothes out. Well, you still are, she retorts wittily. I let out a chuckle. I love being here. I grew up here as a kid, and so the folks here are pretty warm towards us. And although the apartment is awfully small, it feels comfier than my bungalow. I try visiting Mum as often as I can after cancer took Dad away a couple of years ago. The rain outside intensifies. You know, my doctor says that having almonds with honey is good for memory. Mum explains. So, you've included it in your diet? Nah, I always forget about it. We both laugh. Over the years, we've both developed a friend-like bond, which helps us in sharing things we otherwise wouldn't have shared. I'll be back, she says as she nods towards the bathroom. I give a slight nod and continue with my ironing. As time passes, I realize that it has almost been 15 minutes since she had gone to the bathroom. She should have been back by now. I set down the machine and make my way to the bathroom, knocking gently on the door. I don't get a reply. The light inside and the sound of water running are enough for me to assume that she's still in there. But I knock again. I hear a single knock back. Assuming everything is okay inside, I come back to the living room. To my utter disbelief, I see my mum sitting on the couch and still cutting tomatoes. She looks up and flashes me a smile. What? That is all I'm able to say. She doesn't answer it. I calm myself down. I don't reason with myself right away. I look for more information. Trying to keep my voice steady, I ask her, "Weren't you in the bathroom right now?" She looks up from the chopping board, with a face as confused as mine. Huh? No. I was here, chopping tomatoes. I tried to find some logic in the situation. Perhaps she didn't go to the bathroom after all. But that doesn't explain the light being on and the water running. Perhaps while I was outside the bathroom, she had already come back but forgotten to turn the lights and the tap off. But I would have seen her come back had this happened. And none of this explains the knock that I heard. I go back to the bathroom to check for a potential intruder. The rational part of me argues that no intruder can come in through our tiny bathroom window. But I push that thought aside for a while as I enter the bedroom and make my way towards the bathroom. I am left perplexed when I see the bathroom door open and the lights and the tap turned off. None of it makes sense. I feel my t-shirt clinging to my skin, drenched in sweat. The air feels too stuffy now. Like a thunderbolt, a thought hits me. Mum. I need to go check in on her. With a rush of adrenaline, I jump across the bed and dart through the hallway to the living room. I don't see her on the couch where she was sitting before. I check the kitchen. The sound of silence receives me. I return to the bedroom once more, knowing deep down that I will not find her there. I call her cell phone in despair. I hear it ringing outside in the living room. I dash out of the apartment, not bothering to put on shoes. I feel the wet floor against my bare feet. Within seconds, I'm at the apartment's parking lot, maneuvering my way past every parked car, looking for Mum. I am greeted with nothing but silence and darkness. As desperation starts to creep in, I feel increasingly helpless. I run out of the parking lot and into the empty street. I see families at their homes, enjoying their dinner. I see brothers playing video games, couples watching movies. I move past them, towards the end of the street, scanning every square inch of my surroundings. I don't see Mum anywhere. I call the police. Initially, they suspect me for the disappearance of my mother. Over time, they realize that I'm not guilty, however. I don't talk about that incident with anyone, not even my wife or my daughter. All of it is still too raw, too fresh. I need to know if Mum's ever going to come back. Every day I wake up hoping I'd hear something about her. And every day, my heart shatters into a million pieces when I don't. Her case has already been put with several other missing persons cases, where, eventually, it will be forgotten. And today, nearly 4 months after the incident, I knock on my daughter's bathroom door after she's been in there for too long. I hear a single knock back. Do you know the first rule they drill into you about wilderness survival? Never panic. But that's easier said than done, no matter how seasoned you think you are, no matter the toughness you claim. The moment you realize you are completely alone, with no clear path home, panic doesn't just creep in, it floods you. The true test lies not in avoiding this terror, but in mastering the art of regaining your composure once fear has taken hold. I was 11 years old then, on a week-long trip to Havasupai with my church group sometime in August. I never really believed in anything they talked about on Sundays, but I was from a poor family, and they always paid for my trips. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. In fact, I wouldn't have had much of a childhood at all, if not for them. If you've never been to Havasupai, imagine this. After trekking a grueling half-marathon through the sun-blasted, arid expanses of the Grand Canyon, you stumble upon an untouched paradise of rivers and waterfalls. A verdant oasis that defies the desolate landscape around it. Look it up. Pictures don't do it justice, but they come close. I digress. The hike there is a downward trek of 10 miles. Naturally, the return is its uphill counterpart. Picture this: a slightly pudgy 11-year-old me, trudging uphill 10 miles in 90-degree heat. It was manageable though, as long as we stayed in our groups. We were a few dozen strong, so those of us who were slower started in front. Fatigue set in quickly, and I fell back to the next group. Another 20 minutes, and I dropped back again. Each step a growing struggle. The trail was a ribbon between towering stone walls carved by creeks over millennia, with other stretches laid bare beneath the unforgiving sun, the foliage cleared away. I can't pinpoint exactly how it happened. I was staring at my feet, the soft thud of my water bottle against my thigh marking each step, my mind adrift in a sea of fatigue and heat. When I looked up, I found myself in a clearing. The path I had been following vanished, replaced by the random scatter of sagebrush under the harsh sun. I backtracked, hoping to find the trail, but it was as if it had evaporated. Panic set in, tears streaming down my face as I broke into a desperate sprint. After a minute, the trail was still nowhere in sight. I turned, running, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. My heart was a drumbeat against my chest, my mouth dry as I looked at the quarter-liter of water in my bottle. Just a few sips left. I was going to die. That was the only thought in my mind. I ran in another direction, my voice hoarse as I screamed again. Help! Help! I pushed on for minutes that felt like hours. There was nothing, only the relentless, hot, desolate landscape stretching out endlessly around me. The sun bore down, turning the canyon into a furnace, the heat mirroring the mounting hysteria in my mind. I looked around the vast canyon, what looked like miles in any direction, for any sign of life, any dots of trekkers on the rim, anything. But there was nothing. It was around 2 p.m., and the sun wasn't going down any time soon. In my desperation, I cried out for God to please save me. But still, silence. To be honest, I'm going to die wasn't a coherent thought in my head. It was more primal than that, a visceral sensation that grips you. Those who have felt it know what I mean. It's not about thinking in words. It's about experiencing a raw, unfiltered surge of dread. Panic is the essence of fear, a state where planning and logic are drowned out by an overwhelming wave of despair. I collapsed onto the scorched earth, feeling the sting of the hot sand against my hands and knees. My tears fell, disappearing almost instantly as they met the ground, a poignant symbol of my fleeting life being consumed by the unforgiving soul of the desert. As I sat there, a small but vibrant splash of color caught my eye. A red bird, flitting from one parched tree to another. It was the first sign of life I had seen in what felt like an eternity. The sight of it sparked a flicker of hope in my heart. Perhaps, I thought, this bird knows where to find water. Driven by a mix of desperation and instinct, I followed the bird. It seemed almost aware of my presence, waiting for me from branch to branch. My pace quickened, my eyes locked on this beacon of red against the bleached sky. The bird led me through a less trodden path, clotted with the occasional greenery that managed to survive in this harsh environment. And then, ahead, I saw something. Or rather, someone. There was a Native American man sitting on a fallen log, the red bird perched calmly on his shoulder. He looked up as I approached, his eyes meeting mine with a depth of understanding that was almost unsettling. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice gentle, echoing strangely in the vast silence of the canyon. I could only nod, wiping away the tears and dust that clung to my face, trying to steady my breathing. "Then rejoice, for you have been found," he said, his tone warm. I stood there, the awkwardness clinging to me like the heat. "Can you help me find the trail?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse from screaming. "You're already on a trail," he replied with a gentle smile. "But it's not my trail," I protested. "It's a trail, and it's the one you're on," he countered. I was confused. The raw fear that clouded my mind had begun to subside, and I felt clear thoughts slowly coming back to me. "I need to find my group," I insisted. "The group that left you to die in this heat?" He snapped back, his tone suddenly sharp. "Seems like they're the ones that need to find you." His words stung as I realized the truth in his statement. I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. The man's eyes lingered on me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I can help you find your way home, but you must listen carefully. Follow the echo of my voice, and you will be safe." I knew it was strange, but it was my only option, so I simply nodded in agreement. He stood up from the log, the red bird fluttering to a nearby branch, watching intently. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, his voice ringing through the air. "This way." The echo reverberated through the canyon walls, fading into the distance. I listened intently, and after a moment, I heard the echo return, faint but unmistakable. "This way." I turned back to thank the man, but he had vanished. Only the red bird remained, hopping between branches, tilting its head as if to beckon me forward. I took a deep breath and began to follow the bird. It led me through the rocky terrain, flitting from branch to branch, pausing occasionally to ensure I was still behind. I listened for the echo of the voice, and every now and then it would come again, faint but clear. This way. I walked for what felt like hours, through rocky terrain and across sun-scorched patches of desert. The red bird was my only guide, hopping ahead, then pausing to make sure I was still following. The familiar echo sounded intermittently. This way, drawing me forward. The canyon twisted and wound around itself, and I felt disoriented, but the bird remained steady. I scrambled over loose stones, ducked beneath overhanging branches, and navigated through narrow passageways as the sun bore down relentlessly. At one point, the bird perched atop a barren tree, and I heard the echo again. This way. Faint, but clear. I followed, feeling the sting of sand against my cheeks as the wind picked up. My throat was parched, and my legs ached, but I pushed on. The bird led me to a small clearing surrounded by towering canyon walls. For a moment, I thought I was still lost. But then, I heard the distant voices of my group. Brandon? Brandon! The group turned as one and ran toward me, relief washing over their faces. They hugged me, patting my back, and bombarded me with questions. Where were you? We were so worried. Thank God you're safe. Warmth spread through my chest as I looked around at their familiar faces. I was overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. They handed me water and snacks, and I quickly gulped them down. The leaders fussed over me, checking for signs of heat exhaustion. You're going to be okay, one of them said reassuringly. I smiled and nodded, feeling a sense of safety for the first time in hours. I sat down on a rock, letting the cool breeze wash over me as the group gathered around, chatting and laughing. But just as I was about to speak, I heard a whisper on the wind. This way. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I have to go, I stammered, backing away. The leader's voice deepened. You're not going anywhere. In that moment, I heard the whisper again, urgent and clear. This way. I spun around and bolted, shoving past the clawing hands and running toward the ridge. I could hear them behind me, their voices rising in a cacophony of shrieks and howls. I glanced back once and saw the group standing in a line at the edge of the clearing, their faces twisted in anger, their eyes burning with a malevolent glow. They watched me with predatory intent, their laughter echoing through the canyon. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I heard the voice again, closer this time. This way. The red bird fluttered ahead, guiding me through the twisting paths of the canyon. I followed, barely daring to look back, until I stumbled upon a familiar part of the trail. I recognized the marker stones and the way the path curved around a large boulder. Ahead, I saw another group of people, and my heart leaped with relief when I recognized the faces of my real friends. They looked up as I approached, their expressions a mix of shock and joy. "Brandon, there you are," one of the leaders cried, rushing to me and wrapping me in a tight hug. "We were so worried." I got lost," I managed to say, tears welling up in my eyes as I looked around at the familiar faces. "But I'm okay now." The group gathered around me, offering water and snacks, and fussing over me with genuine concern. As I sat down to rest, I noticed a red bird perched on a nearby tree branch, watching silently. I smiled and gave a small nod of gratitude. The bird chirped softly and flew away, disappearing into the bright blue sky. I listened carefully for the voice, but all I heard was the laughter and chatter of my friends. The canyon was still, and for the first time since I had gotten lost, I felt truly safe. It's been about 20 years since that day in Havasupai, and honestly, I'd almost forgotten about it. Life moved on, and the memories of that canyon faded into the hazy backdrop of childhood. But every now and then, something happens that brings it all rushing back. Last week, I got a message from Mark, one of my old friends from the church group. He suggested we catch up over a few drinks at a local bar. I hadn't spoken to him in ages, but I figured it would be nice to reconnect. The bar was dimly lit, and Mark was already sitting at a table in the corner when I arrived. He hadn't changed much, still the same lanky frame, still laughing too loudly at his own jokes. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a grin. "Brandon, a long time no see, my friend. How have you been?" "Not bad," I replied, smiling. "How about you?" We exchanged small talk for a while, reminiscing about old times and filling in the gaps of the years that had passed. He seemed warm and genuine, but there was something off about his eyes. Something intense and unsettling. After a few drinks, Mark leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Hey, remember that camping trip to Havasupai?" "Yeah, of course. Hard to forget that one." A smile flickered across his lips. "Yeah. We were all so worried when you were gone. But you weren't really lost, were you?" "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. He chuckled softly and leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "Sometimes the ones who get lost don't really get to come back." I nervously shifted in my seat and took a sip of my drink before changing the topic. A few minutes later, he suggested that we check out his new car. He seemed quite proud of it, so I obliged. We put on our jackets and headed out into the cold night. The wind bit at my face as we turned down an unlit alley toward the parking lot. Mark walked ahead of me, humming softly, his breath visible in the frigid air. As we approached the lot, I glanced up and noticed a red bird perched on top of a stoplight, its bright plumage stark against the darkness. It cocked its head to the side and chirped softly. Then I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable, carried by the wind. This way. Disclaimer. The content of this audio narration contains discussions of suicidal ideations, which some listeners may find distressing. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm or suicide, please remember that help is available. Reach out to your local helpline or crisis support services. You don't have to go through this alone. Support is just a call away. When I was 13, and an idiot, like most 13-year-olds are, I spent a lot of time on a now defunct app called Chatterbox. It operated a lot like a more clunky version of Discord, where you could chat with strangers online, either through community groups or private messages. For context, I should mention that I was a bit of a troubled teenager. I grew up in a dysfunctional household with largely absent parents, and I was bullied pretty severely all throughout middle school. I found solace in one particular Chatterbox community called Teens X Fashion, which, as I'm sure you can guess, was a place to discuss fashion and aesthetic trends of the mid-2010s. It was supposed to be a place for people aged 13 to 18, but now that I'm older and wiser, I'm pretty sure that 90% of the people I met on that server were much older guys. Through the server, I met a 17-year-old guy named Jack. I don't remember his Chatterbox username, but I remember him being a kind and charismatic presence in our community. We talked almost every day for 2 years, and he quickly became my #1 confidant. From the time I entered high school at age 14, the bullying got worse, as did my home situation, and though I was never diagnosed by a professional, I'm pretty sure I was depressed. I began having some suicidal thoughts, and when I told Jack about them, he seemed sympathetic. I don't blame you. This world is such a shit show. I think about ending things sometimes too. I was pleased that he, unlike my school guidance counselor and the few other people I told about my thoughts, didn't brush them off and promise me things would get better. I found myself oddly charmed by his candidness. "You're still pretty young," he texted me once. "Maybe wait a year or so. Give life another try. If it hasn't gotten any better by then, let's talk some more." I took his advice and waited for things to get better, but I saw no light at the end of the tunnel. By the time I was 15, I'd dropped out of high school. I barely left my room, and I was having trouble performing basic tasks like brushing my teeth. When I told Jack about my state, he said, "Honestly, I haven't been doing well either. I bought some cyanide pills a few months back, just waiting for the right time." I was surprised to hear this. Jack had always seemed like a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. After thinking about what he said for a few weeks, and doing some research on the pills he mentioned, I asked if I could buy a few off of him, just in case, and he agreed. I suggested he ship them to me, but after some discussion, I was shocked to learn that we both lived in the same state. I didn't want to give him my home address, the only intelligent thought I'd had throughout this whole ordeal, and so we agreed to meet in a public place, a coffee shop about an hour away from where I lived. A few weeks later, our agreed-upon meeting date rolled around, and I took the bus to the coffee shop. I had the selfies he'd posted to Teens X Fashion as reference, but when I entered the shop and looked around, I didn't see anyone who vaguely resembled the pictures. I walked around, figuring he must be late, before I heard someone shout my name from the corner table. I looked at the man who'd called out to me. It had to be Jack. No one else would know me by name. But he looked different. He was much taller and heavier than he appeared in the photos, and much older as well. It was difficult to tell what age he exactly was, but he certainly wasn't 19. I walked over and asked his name, and he gave me both the name Jack and his chatterbox handle. He gave me a friendly smile as I sat across from him. He wasn't a bad-looking guy, and he seemed to have put a lot of effort into his appearance for our meeting, but I was thrown off by the discrepancy in how old he was supposed to be, and how old he appeared. Before we'd said much to one another, a barista came over to take our order, which in retrospect was unusual for a coffee shop. The barista's name was Lydia, and she was this petite blonde lady, probably 21 at most. She took our order and then left us to a very awkward, stilted conversation. I didn't know what to say. I'd been excited to meet my friend of 2 years, but now that I was actually there, it all felt like too much. I was so quiet that Jack seemed to take offense after a while. "Hey," he said at one point. I hadn't even realized I was averting my eyes from his. But when I looked up at him, he was giving me this weird, almost pitiful look. "You're mad because I gained weight, aren't you? You think I'm ugly?" I was taken aback. "No," I said. "I don't think you're ugly at all." He seemed genuinely upset. All of a sudden, I felt like a terrible person, like I was taking advantage of him or something. I rushed to console him, partially because I was worried that he wouldn't have given me the pills, but also because he was pretty much the only friend I had, and I was terrified of ruining things. Soon I was the one leading the conversation, pulling him back out of his shell little by little. It was all very odd. The barista came back after a while. I said thank you as she put our drinks down, but she didn't leave afterwards. She just kept standing there, looking at us with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "All good here, folks?" Lydia asked, staring directly at me. I told her everything was great, and then she reluctantly returned to the counter. Jack and I finished our drinks largely in silence. I remember very strongly not wanting to look directly at his face. Well, like I said, he wasn't a bad-looking guy, but his eyes seemed unnaturally dull, like the light wasn't hitting them right or something. Once we'd finished drinking, and Jack still hadn't made any mention of the pills, I broached the topic myself. "They're in my car," he said in response to my inquiry. He leaned his face close to mine and lowered his voice, giving me a wink that was anything but charming. "We might both get in trouble if I handed you a bag of pills in a public space like this." I guessed that made sense. So we tossed our drinks and I followed him outside. The parking lot was full of people. Not exactly a prime location for a child abduction, so I didn't have any second thoughts about walking with him. But when we reached the last row of cars, and Jack kept going, I slowed down. "Oh, I'm parked a ways down the road," he said when I asked where he was going. He gave a condescending little laugh. like I'd asked him a stupid question.
Again, I can't be handing you cyanide pills in front of everyone. Silly.
I stopped walking. I was starting to think that I didn't know this person as well as I'd thought, and I certainly didn't want to be alone with him in an isolated area. But then again, did I even care what happened to me? Wasn't I ready to go anyways? Jack noticed that I'd stopped. He turned around and walked back over to me, placing a meaty, sweaty hand on my shoulder. Even in the direct sunlight, his eyes looked strangely dark.
Come on now,
he said, gruffly, and started guiding me further from the parking lot. It was then that I realized that, despite all my misgivings about the world, I really did still care what happened to me. I didn't want to be hurt. I didn't want to die. I raised an arm and tried to push Jack's hand off my shoulder, but he tightened his grip so hard I thought he was about to break a bone. I thought I was done for, before a shout from behind us startled us both. "Hey, stop right now!" I turned my head towards the parking lot and saw the barista from earlier running towards us at full speed. "You stop right there!" Now, this woman was maybe 4'11", and I'm pretty sure Jack could have picked her up and thrown her like a football if he wanted to. But her voice was loud and strong, and as she yelled out, she attracted a lot of attention. As soon as he realized we'd been spotted, he let go of my shoulder and made a run for it. Lydia came to a stop next to me, taking my hand and gently guiding me back towards the group of witnesses in the parking lot. Once we'd made it to safety, she called the police, who arrived quickly to take our statements. However, after listening to my whole story, they ended up taking me to the station for questioning. Lydia came along with me, which made me feel a lot better. To make a long story short, the man I'd met up with was not a 19-year-old named Jack, but a 38-year-old named John Davis Harrison, who the police were able to identify from the photos Lydia had taken at the coffee shop. He was arrested the following day after police found the skeletal remains of 2 women and 1 man stuffed between the mattress and the box springs of his bed. Harrison admitted to luring his victims, all of whom had confined their suicidal thoughts in him, with the promise of a quick death via cyanide pills. In reality, the slow, painful deaths his victims endured at his hands were etched into their bones. The whole ordeal was the wake-up call of the century for me. In the aftermath, I went back to high school and started to really apply myself in class. I graduated a year late, but I also graduated with really high marks. I started seeing an awesome therapist at age 16, and thanks to him and a few counselors at my school, I transitioned into a foster family that is now my adoptive family. I actually enjoy living these days, and despite the title of this post, I have not a murderer, but one brave barista to thank for my life now. We still keep in touch, and I am happy to report that she's doing well too. Thank you, Lydia, for looking out for a clueless kid who didn't know what they were getting themselves into. Now that I'm older and wiser, I promise to do the same. So, a few days ago, I had to fly to San Francisco for a conference. I'm from a fairly large city, and I don't have a car. Unfortunately, that means I, like most people, am stuck with taking public transit. This wouldn't be a problem, except for the fact that since the city isn't as big as New York or Chicago, the trains are sometimes infrequent, especially in the early morning. My flight was fairly early, so I was worried about taking the train, but I didn't want to shell out money for an Uber, so I decided to go for it. I arrived at the station at 4:50 a.m. because maps told me the train would be arriving at 5 a.m. I had never seen the train station so empty. Besides me, I could count maybe a few other people. A college-aged girl, a mum and her child, and a businessman. 5 a.m. passed, then 5:01, 5:03, 5:08, and 5:12. I started panicking. I was already cutting it close to my arrival time at the airport, and if I didn't get on the train soon, I would miss my flight. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the lights from the train at the end of the tunnel. I checked my watch, which read 5:13. Well, better late than never. The train came to a stop. Weirdly, only the doors to one car opened. Maybe it was because it was so early in the morning. Like they were trying to conserve energy or something. Since we had no other option, all of us at the platform entered the car and sat down. I was feeling a bit better about making my flight on time because I had finally gotten on the train. There were about 6 stops before the airport, so I could sit back and relax for a bit. About 40 minutes had passed, and we had left the last stop before the airport. We entered another dark tunnel when the train suddenly lurched to a stop. Just my luck. Of course, we'd stopped right before we got to the airport.
Hey folks, we're going to be adding a couple extra stops before the airport today. It shouldn't cause too much of a delay, so please be patient. If you want my advice, I would stay on the train no matter what.
As soon as the train operator stopped speaking, there was just silence in the car. Everyone on the train looked extremely confused. We were still in that dark tunnel when the doors suddenly opened. Not a single person had gotten on the train car at any other stop. But at this stop, almost 20 people, men, women, and children, entered the train car in a single file line. Now, the almost empty car of before was now uncomfortably full. The doors snapped shut, and we were moving again. The second we were in motion, 20 sets of eyes were on me. And that wasn't all. The strange group of people that had just gotten on the train, the pack of them, had this identical smile on their faces. I felt extremely uneasy under their smiles, which were directed only at me. Then, like a switch, everyone shifted their gaze and smiled at the businessman on the train. There was a pause for a couple of seconds, and then they turned and smiled at the mum and her child. Then the college girl. It was like they were on a timer, because they then turned back to me. All 20 people were looking at me with that plastered smile on their faces. I felt sick to my stomach. There was something extremely wrong with these people. The train stopped again, at another station I had never ever seen before. It was above ground, with lush greenery and the sun shining brightly. Something called to me, and I made a move to get up, partly wanting to get away from the smiling people, and partly because it just looked like peace. But somewhere in my mind, I remember the train operator's warning that I didn't understand earlier. Stay on the train, no matter what. Then, as quickly as I had the urge to get off the train, I sat back down. The train doors opened slowly, and the college girl from earlier quickly made her way onto the platform with a queasy look on her face. I made a move to stop her, but it was too late. She had already gotten off the train. I could see her on the platform, facing the opposite direction from me. She slowly turned around, and my heart stopped, because she stared at me with a smile that was all too familiar. Like they were lifted from a spell, the smiling people got off of the train in a single file line, and they all lined up on the platform in a neat line with the college girl smack dab in the middle. The train doors closed again, and we were moving. But from the window, I could see everyone on the platform with that sick, same smile, waving at us in unison. It was about a minute or two before the train stopped again, but this time it was at the airport. The rest of us on the train looked at each other uneasily, but slowly exited the train. The platform this time was packed with busy travelers, looking to get home. The mom and her child left without a word, but the businessman and I made eye contact as we stood on the platform. We shared a look that conveyed that this strange train ride did indeed happen, before we both parted ways. I'm still in San Francisco right now, but when I think back to the smiling people on the train, I'm still met with an unending sense of dread. But I'm extremely thankful that I listened to the train operator and stayed on the train. I do know one thing for sure. I need to buy a fucking car. Have you ever heard of the Japanese soldiers who didn't surrender along with the rest of their country in 1945 and spent decades hidden away in the belief that World War II raged on? The town I lived in for the early parts of my life gave me a similar experience. As kids in our small town, we all grew up with the same story. It was late October 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis threatened to engulf our planet in a fiery apocalypse. On the evening of October 27th, the townsfolk tucked themselves into bed for an inevitably restless night of sleep, whilst radio and television chatter in the background provided increasingly worried-sounding commentary of the situation at hand. At some point, the signals grew garbled before eventually turning into static, and the constant noise of live updates was suddenly sorely missed. Before dawn came, unfamiliar men in army fatigues went door to door and led the townspeople into the large shelter built beneath their feet in anticipation of this exact scenario. Before dawn came, unfamiliar men in army fatigues went door to door and led the townspeople into the large shelter built beneath their feet in anticipation of the exact scenario they had been alerted to. Supposedly, some people refused, with the explanation that there had been no official communication of an attack or a state of war, and that they would not comply if they were allowed to find out for themselves through their long defunct radio and television sets. Childhood rumor had it that none of these people were seen again. I was born a decade after that night. My first memory is playing catch with myself against a decaying concrete wall in the shelter. It was a pretty big place, bigger than you would expect for a town of our size. And life down there did its best to mimic the lives we have all had stolen from us. Those efforts were admirable, but ultimately fruitless. There was a dingy little school for the kids, a community kitchen with massive stockpiles of awful canned food, and large rooms filled with rows upon rows of rusting metal bunk beds. Still though, life in the shelter was awful. I would not wish being trapped underground with hundreds of people for decades on anybody, and the drab existence took its toll on the older townspeople who had once known a life far better than that one. There was a room that became notorious for the sheer amount of people who took their own lives there. They had to get creative with such limited resources, and sometimes it would take days or weeks for anybody to die, after cutting their wrists with a dull and rusty knife. I would know, because my father died in that godforsaken room. They found his lifeless body dangling from the ceiling, and little 10-year-old me was left in a state of agony. They found his lifeless body dangling from the ceiling, and little 10-year-old me was left in a state of agony. I didn't talk for months after it happened, and sometimes I still wish it had been me instead of him. Then, at least, I wouldn't be burdened with the knowledge I have today. I remember being taught about the aftermath of the night that started all of this in school. We were told that most of our nation and the world had been ravaged by clouds of smoke and pillars of fire. That life on the ground above us was practically impossible. That we had to stay there forever, lest we face the horrible deaths we had been saved from. There were a lot of rules to ensure that we stuck to those ideals, but we were far too terrified to be skeptical of anything we were taught, and so those rules went untested. It took me until I was 19 to question the teachings we were expected to take as absolute truths. You see, whilst I was mostly a good citizen and complied with the rules of the shelter, I did have a sneaky little habit. I don't know why. Perhaps I had grown bored, or just wanted to disobey the seemingly arbitrary rules for once. But I had a borderline obsession with exploring the nooks and crannies of the shelter, finding untouched corners and hints of a life that supposedly didn't exist anymore. It gave me a thrill I didn't know was possible in that place. Those hints were usually boring by any outside measure. But one day, I found something that left me both in awe and bewildered terror. A window. I didn't know what it was at first, because when I came across it, all I could see was a build-up of dust and cobwebs in the shape of a square. But I quickly got to work peeling away the layers that had built up over what was presumably a great many years to reveal something out of my wildest dreams. An impossibly green landscape stood before my eyes. The sky was a deep blue, with an occasional cloud floating by. And the houses abandoned decades before lay there in unmaintained condition that gave them a unique character. I must have stood there for hours, taking it all in, wondering why the world I was taught about wasn't what I was staring at, wondering why we had been lied to. I made my way back to my bunk bed at some point and settled in for a night of restless sleep. I had very few moments that weren't pierced by the supposedly impossible landscape that I had seen. It took me weeks to bottle up the courage to go back, because I was terrified that my eyes had somehow deceived me, that I was losing my mind, and that I would end up in that room with the same fate my father faced. I couldn't tell anyone, and I didn't tell anyone. They would think I was losing my mind too, and understandably so. Eventually, though, I did go back, armed with a little piece of my bed that I had managed to break off. Do you know what it's like to have a burning desire to step out into a world that you had always been taught would kill you as soon as it got the chance? Because I do. The perfect palette of colours before me was too strong to resist. I needed to go out there, to run my fingers along the green grass, and to breathe in the air that had been meant for me. So, I did. The window was large enough that after the glass was broken into minuscule pieces, it was easy for me to climb out. I took my first step that wasn't in that shelter, and inhaled for as long as I could, whilst my lungs filled with cool, wonderful air. I turned my head back towards the window, only to find it was gone. Bare concrete lay in front of me, and my way out was no longer my way back in. Despite my confusion, I figured it was some long-forgotten security redundancy. I quickly forgot about that, though, as I refocused on the reality of life outside of that place. It was real. It was all real. I wasn't losing my mind. Everything I had seen through the window was exactly the same once I had rid myself of its constraints. Except one thing. It was out of view from the window, so I hadn't seen it before I climbed out. It pierced the otherwise impossibly pristine landscape around me. An army van. All 4 doors lay open, and there was a singular person in the front seat. His head had a bullet hole clearly through it, and any blood from the incident had long dried up. As I walked closer to the van, I noticed a piece of paper between the deceased soldier's dangling foot. It read, "To whoever is lucky enough to read this, I am sorry for what we did to your people, to your families. During the Cold War, the unit I worked for was ordered to implement a psychological experiment. It went too far. We were supposed to keep you in the shelter for a year, to test our readiness for what seemed like an inevitable future. To find out whether a shelter of that scale and nature could be our saving grace, our hope for rebuilding civilization in the event of the bombs finally falling. It was unethical at best, but I rationalized it with the false comfort of doing a service to our nation. I told myself that perhaps our research would one day keep us all alive, even if it meant total torment for the people of your town. Well, a year came and left quite a while ago. Slowly, governmental and military interest in this little experiment dried up. On the night that this all began, You were led to believe that the bombs were fast approaching our nation. The people who refused to believe our word, legitimized only by army fatigues and commanding voices, were the smart ones. That's why it hurt so much when we were ordered to line them up against the wall and shoot them. They deserved so much better. The truth is that Cold War tensions began to ease following the emotional high point of the missile crisis, and over the years the need for shelters subsided. With it, as I mentioned before, so did interest in our experiment. Our men filtered out over the course of months and years, until I was the only one left. Perhaps the guilt I felt, the guilt that gnawed at me during every waking moment, kept me here. I had no purpose, no resources, and no way to get to the people we had condemned to a miserable life years before. Still, though, the empty remnants of the town this once was kept a tight grip on me, and I have never been able to leave. I will never leave. This is where I deserve to die, where I deserve to pay for the sins I committed upon the people who were once here. I hope and pray this letter someday finds a citizen of this condemned town, and I hope my confession can bring you some peace. I do not expect you to forgive me, nor do I deserve it. But please know that every moment I remain alive will be spent in impossibly deep regret. I have one final wish. Please, bury my body and this letter as deep as you can dig in the soil of this town. I deserve to be forever condemned to an existence underneath the ground of where this all began. An existence you have wrongly been forced to partake in. I hope my pain is far worse than we made yours. Goodbye. I must have sobbed for hours on end after reading the letter, and the days and weeks after that were a haze. Much of what I remember is made up of trying to get back into the shelter in a desperate bid to give my fellow townspeople the freedom of the life we were supposed to have. At every turn and entrance, I was met with meters of concrete, and I never succeeded in getting back into the shelter. I don't remember how long I tried, but eventually I gave up and decided to grant the deceased soldier his final wish. I dug for days and buried him outside the area where the window that started this all used to be. I know he said he doesn't deserve forgiveness, but he had the dignity to understand the awful nature of what he did, and he stayed with us until his end. He was a far better man than those who left us behind, forgotten about, and condemned. I hope his regrets are washed away in the soil of our town. As for me, I left the town a long time ago. I lost my way out as I was leaving, and I was never told the original name of the town in the shelter, so unfortunately, the memories are all the proof of my experience I have. The outside world took a lot of getting used to, but in the years since my escape, I have grown to be okay with my new life. Still, though, I will never forget what I left behind, even if it was decades ago. My entire life was in that shelter. Everybody I knew and all that I loved. I wake up every morning having been tormented by nightmares of still being stuck in that deep, dark, underground prison. and yet I often find myself wishing for the comfort of those I lost upon my escape. I hope they found their peace with my sudden disappearance, but something in me knows they haven't. My pain and terror out here is almost as great as it was in there. Maybe ignorance is actually bliss, like they say. Perhaps someday the townsfolk I once knew will be greeted with the same view of blue skies and green meadows that I was. In the meantime, I desperately hope that they found a better existence in the shelter than the one I once knew. What can I say? I'm the employee of a horrifying shape-shifting monster, but it's just the way it is, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it was all working fine until Sharon was eaten. Sharon was too obvious, and now the whole cover-up will be blown. You'll hear it in the news, so I might as well tell you now. Yeah, we knew Dwayne was a monster. Like, a real one. We think he might have come from space, but it doesn't really matter now. He would eat customers. That much is true. For the most part, only old, elderly ones that came alone at night. But those weren't the ones we were worried about. It was the high-risk customers, once every 4 months or so, that we had to be vigilant about. It always happened around his own system of holidays. What were his holidays? Well, let me explain. June 7th. Stomp Day. Stomp Day was Stomp Day. You arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, and were paid a lot of money to stay for the next 14 hours instead of 8. At about a dozen different times throughout the day, you'd stomp on the ground as hard as you could. The idea was to hide it. Like, sorry, I was carrying this big load of plywood, and so I accidentally stomped as I almost lost balance. Or you could just stomp on a pallet jack to prevent swerving. You would be surprised at how many discreet ways you can stomp right by a person's face and get away with it. The purpose of the stomping was to make customers flinch, which had something to do with building up a certain level of unease in the store. At the end of the day, the employee who could get the most flinches was awarded 3 months' pay and an all-black Rubik's Cube. I'll get to that later. The hardest part was that you were competing with everyone else, and you were only allotted 7 tries at specific timestamps in the day, or time stomps, as we called them. Everyone's time stomps were different. Mine were 8:21, 9 o'clock, 10:37, 11:40, 21:32, 21:33, 21:34. It was easiest just to set alarms on your phone. I always brought a spare battery for my dying iPhone 10. Anyway, if you could get someone really startled, Dwayne would show up and be very apologetic, and tell the customer they can get a free DeVault power drill from the back. He would take them into the loading bay and into that room none of us were allowed in. You'll see it on the news. And then, well, the customer would be gone forever. But trust me, no one noticed. It's why we were able to get away with it for so long. Dwayne had some intuitive way of choosing single, fairly antisocial people usually homeowners. So when they disappeared, it took a while for friends and family to catch on, and the police never had any leads. October 14th, St. Quelber's cleaning day. Before you go asking who St. Quelber is, we have no fucking clue. I should explain that Dwayne definitely does not speak English as his first language. I'd love to get some linguist or geneticist to tell me where he could possibly be from. Apparently, Quelber is some priest? An angel? Maybe Dwayne's mother. For whatever reason, Dwayne settled on the name St. Quelber, and we just rolled with it. There wasn't any hard start to this holiday. You could book any kind of 6 or 8 hour shift, but if you were working on St. Quelber's, you'd better bring a bandana or N95 mask. Dwayne would basically fumigate the entire store with some chemical I can only describe as minty bleach. We would put up signs throughout the store that said we were having a cleaning day. Customers seemed to put up with it. Everyone just grabbed a courtesy COVID mask from the front and did their shopping as usual. But the closer you got to the back of the store, the stronger that minty bleach smell got. I should mention it wasn't like a hazy smoke or anything. It was completely translucent, more of a mist. If you were working on this day, you had to carry a rag in your back pocket and clean any stains you spotted on the floor or shelves. The substance in the air basically made any stain come out instantly. Yeah, I hated to think what it might have done to my eyes and skin, but I never had any adverse reactions. Thank God. Inevitably, some customer with asthma or a cold or something would have a coughing fit and start spewing up phlegm. If the customer met Dwayne's criteria, he would graciously offer them the employee washroom in the back, where they could go clean themselves up. And then, yep, you guessed it, he would eat them. But listen, we knew he ate people. I'm not pretending we didn't. We're definitely guilty of that. We just never directly killed anyone ourselves. We were at worst accessories to murder, or coerced into compliance. In fact, I know it seems like we only enabled his behavior, which is true, but we were kind of forced to play along. It'll make more sense when I explain the next holiday. March 24th, Annual Graduation. If you want to work at Dwayne's depot, you have to sign a year-long contract. It was very explicit. Dwayne always explained to new employees that he's sick of a high turnover, so he would guarantee you a customer service job, fairly well paying, as long as you committed to a year. Obviously, the law states you can give your 2 weeks' notice at any job and leave, but Dwayne makes you sign an incredibly sophisticated contract that supposedly circumvents this law. As you'd imagine, this deters a lot of people, which is totally fine. Dwayne only seeks the committed. And so he filters out applicants until he gets someone who is desperate for a stable, decent-paying job with little experience, e.g., high school dropouts like me. Anyway, after a year of work, you are allowed to quit, but only on graduation day, which is generally 365 days after you started. On your graduation, Dwayne invites all the employees into the loading bay, and he sings you a song which is unlike anything you've ever heard, and is genuinely impossible to describe. Afterwards, he gives you a white rubber band with a certain number of tally marks, which I think corresponds to how many people you helped him eat that year. And then you can either move on with your life, keep working part-time at Dwayne's, or commit to another full year with a triple wage increase. We all told Sharon to wait. Just hold out until her graduation on March 27th. Once she got her first white rubber band, she could leave. I'll admit to that in court. Listen, I'm being super upfront about all of this. But she couldn't. She was a week away from her graduation when she snapped. Apparently, she had snuck into Dwayne's room and saw something. Probably the eating process. On the day of her meltdown, I was at the opposite end of the depot when she grabbed a megaphone, which we sell in aisle 30 for about $80. I heard the buzzy click of the megaphone turning on, and then I heard Sharon's hysterical shouts. "We work for a monster. People have died here," etc., etc. I rushed over to shut her up, of course, as did 2 other employees, but she refused to be subdued. Very soon, Dwayne showed up, wiping his mouth and demanding to know what was going on. She tossed the megaphone at him and ran, and so Dwayne chased her into the parking lot, the open-air customer parking lot, in broad daylight, in front of like 20 people. Dwayne caught her by the hair and shrieked an unfathomable sound, like a space lion roar or something. He pulled one of those black Rubik's cubes out from his pocket, and basically, sucked Sharon into it. Customers freaked out. Cars sped away. It was a fucking scene. We all stared with our jaws dropped, not knowing what to do. Wayne just stared back and said, "What are you looking at? Get back to work." The reason I think that Sharon was eaten was because the black cubes were how Dwayne stored his prey. And yes, before you ask, I do have 2 of them. They were awarded to me on some very successful stomp days. No, I have not opened them. I have no clue how they work. And yes, I will be giving them to the police. Honestly, it may not sound like my hands were tied, but my hands were tied. What else was I supposed to do? I don't have a degree and don't qualify for anything in finance, STEM, healthcare, or whatever. I applied to every other place in my neighborhood. I could only land a job at Dwayne's. Obviously, I should go to jail, and I will, but I can't possibly deserve more than 18 months. Like 2 years tops with good behavior. Thanks to Dwayne, I've been able to afford the crazy high rent in this city, pay for food, and now I have enough to pay for school too. I'm just recording this all out here so you can see my side of the story, before the news media spins everything out of control. Anyway, please message me if you know a good lawyer. After all this blows over, I'm going to medical school with a goal to save at least 254 lives. 254. because that's how many tally marks I counted on my white rubber bands. Let me just start by saying my 6-year-old son and I are very close. From an extremely young age, he has been able to sympathize with me and has been extremely emotionally intelligent. The thing is, it's not with everyone. It's just me. He feels like just a regular boy with everyone else, but he always knows what to say when I'm having a hard day. I try not to show it, but he sometimes knows. Emotional intelligence is how I've always played it off, but now I'm not so sure anymore. Since my son could talk and form sentences, he has said things to me that he should have no way of knowing. It started out with him saying things like, "Mummy, don't worry, I still think you are pretty." That day I was really struggling with body image. I put on a few pounds and hated myself. Of course, I didn't let my son see me crying in the mirror or grabbing the rolls on my stomach. I mean, little boys always think their mother is beautiful, right? It's not like he knew. Soon after that, he mentioned to me that he really missed Bethany. I asked him who Bethany was, and he looked at me like I was crazy. He told me it was his sister who died. My son never had a sister. However, I had a sister who died at 16, whose name was Bethany. I never mentioned it to him. I thought maybe it was a fluke. Next, I lost my job. Once again, he had no clue it happened. I was reading him a bedtime story, and he put his hand over the book and looked up at me. He got this serious look on his face and said, "It'll be okay. You'll find a job next week, and it'll pay better too." It felt weird that he found out about the job loss, but I didn't think much about it. Once I did, in fact, get a job next week that also paid better, I was weirded out. I asked my mother about it, and she said it's probably just the close bond that a mother and son always have. Kids are weird. Every parent has their own story of a time when their kid said something terrifying to them. She tried to explain to me. A few months ago, it started to become an everyday thing where he would say something about a subject he shouldn't know about. Then, about a month ago, it went from him knowing things he shouldn't to him saying things like, "I remember when I was a girl and I loved the color purple. I remember when I was a mummy and I cried a lot. I remember when I was a mummy and I wanted to run away." This felt weird to me. It wasn't like he thought he was a girl. I asked him once why he thought he was a girl. He looked at me frustrated and said, "I'm not a girl now. I was a girl before I was a boy." He kept telling me stories of all the things he did when he was a girl. He would tell me things about myself that I've never told anybody, even my husband. When I told my husband, I was starting to get scared of my son. He said I was being dramatic. I guess it doesn't help my case that I didn't tell my husband everything my son said to me. When he said things like missing his dead sister, that was one thing. But, well, let's just say I've not always been a saintly woman. I have a past. I mean, we have all done things we aren't proud of. but my husband doesn't know about these things. First of all, I stole a lot as a teenager. Nothing too crazy. I think a lot of teenagers do that, honestly. The more serious things I kept from him are, I got a DUI in college. My ex has a restraining order over me. I was a stripper for several years. And, worst of all, I cheated on my husband a few years ago. It was dumb, and I regret it. But I will never tell him. My son had mentioned doing all these things when he was a girl, or when he was a mummy. Of course, in child terms. But nonetheless, he described all of those things. He hasn't mentioned much to anyone else. Mostly just me. He hasn't come right out and said that he was me or anything. If he were me, maybe he doesn't realize it. Maybe he just has random, fuzzy memories of another life. Last week, I noticed he seemed down. He wasn't really talking like he normally does. I felt like a terrible mother. I was thankful he wasn't talking. It felt like every time I talked to him, I got more and more scared of him. One day, he crawled into my bed with me in the morning. He took a deep sigh and looked at me. I remember when I was a mummy, and that car hurt me tomorrow. My heart sank, and I didn't even know what to say, but I mustered up the courage. Honey, what is going to happen to me tomorrow? I said while pushing away the hair falling in his face as a nervous tick. I remember it hurting so bad. I don't want you to feel the pain too. Don't go. Don't do it, he said. I sat, looking him deep in his eyes. My bed, which felt so warm and comforting a few minutes ago, now felt cold and hard. What was going to happen to me? I kept asking him what was going to happen. Every time I asked, he got more and more upset. My husband woke up after I asked him for the 5th time. He got so mad at me. I can't blame him. I was clutching our son's shoulders and screaming, "Tell me, tell me." I said it over and over again. My son didn't talk to me for the rest of that day. The next day, I tried to explain to my husband what our son said, and how I was scared, because this was the first time my husband heard of my son saying such crazy things. He didn't believe I was in danger. We had dinner plans with some friends that night. It was the last thing I wanted to do. I figured since my son mentioned a car, I needed to just stay away from them at all costs. I tried to convince my husband I was sick, but he, of course, didn't believe me. I should have said I was sick from the very beginning, and not told him the real reason for wanting to stay home. My son's babysitter made it to the house. As we said our goodnight to our boy, he gave me a sad hug. Not only that, but he couldn't take his eyes off my left hand. After our hug, he grabbed my fingers and squeezed them tightly. I knew something was about to happen to my hand. I felt like I could anticipate the pain. We walked out the door, and my husband guided me to the car door. He opened it up and helped me in. Although it didn't feel like he was trying to be a gentleman. It felt like he was scared that I was going to run. He wasn't wrong. After a few minutes of driving, I felt the anxiety building. I felt sick. At a stoplight, I noticed the car door was unlocked. I slipped off my heels and opened the car door. I was trying to move way faster than my feet could take me. I didn't see the curb and tripped over, face-planting in the process. My husband came running over to help me up. I thought he would be mad that I tried to run away. I thought he would call me a brat or worse. But he didn't. He could see how scared I was. He realized it didn't matter if what I was feeling was real or not, but he needed to respect my fear and worry. He tried to help me back into the car. He said we could go back home, but I refused to go in the car. I told him we had to walk. This is when he started to get frustrated. He felt like he did his best to compromise and emphasize with my anxieties, but he wasn't willing to walk 2 miles home in 40-degree weather at 7 p.m. Looking back, I understand why he was so annoyed. He grabbed my shoulders and took a deep breath. He started nudging me back to the car. The nudging turned into pushing, and the pushing turned into forcing. I was pushing back and doing everything in my power to not go into the car. I was kicking and screaming. A few other cars pulled over to help. I'm sure they were thinking something much worse was actually happening. Before anyone could get to me, he got me into the car. As he was slamming the door, I reached out my hand to try and stop it. The next few minutes were very fuzzy. I could feel my hand pulsing. I could vaguely hear my husband screaming and apologizing profusely, followed by strangers separating us and trying to help. An ambulance showed up a few minutes later, and that's when I noticed my hand. My index, middle, and ring fingers had been smashed in the car door. Half of my middle finger was completely gone. We went to the ER, and about 80% of my fingers were saved, luckily. If it wasn't obvious, my husband felt terrible. Not only for what happened to my fingers, but for being so aggressive with me and not listening. I know I should have been more bothered, but I have other family members I'm more worried about. After that, I accepted that I needed to take what my son said about my future seriously. That week, he said more disturbing things. I remember when I was a mummy and I set the house on fire. I remember when I was a mummy and I stabbed my husband. I remember when I was a mummy and the scary man took me into the forest. I remember when I was a mummy and the monster from the closet hurt me. I was terrified of the things that would happen to me. I know children can't always describe or articulate words that well at a young age, but that didn't help me feel any better. I tried to ask him for details of what he meant, but once he said something, he usually didn't want to talk about it anymore, especially if it seemed to be traumatizing. It's like the memory would flash in his head and it had to be blurted out. The reason I'm recording all of this out in the first place is because of what he told me today. The two of us were coloring at the kitchen table, and without even looking up at me, he said, "I remember when I was a mummy, and my son killed me." I froze in fear. I couldn't believe the chill that ran down my spine, and the fact that he didn't seem fazed by it all. He just kept coloring his pirate ship. I need help. What the heck am I supposed to do? I don't even know how to process any of this. I don't believe in reincarnation or anything like that. even if I did, is that how it even works? There shouldn't be an overlap in lives like this, right? But how else is something like this explained? It's not like my kid can just see the past and future. He has seen my whole life before, and from his perspective. He doesn't find it strange that my life used to be his. He is also aware enough to recognize a memory, like when I lost my job. And he comforted me, knowing that I'll get a new job soon. This whole thing is hurting my brain. I love my son, but I'm so terrified and feel crazy. Someone, please help me. I don't know what to do. To clarify, I worked for the state, driving a white van that transported police officers along with dangerous apprehended criminals from the station to a high-security prison. These criminals included serial killers, sex offenders, and other such abominations. The van had 8 seats in total, 2 at the front separated from 6 at the back by a thick transparent plastic panel for driver protection. I was never specifically told the crimes they had committed, but the drive could be over an hour long, which meant I often had enough to gauge from their conversations and ramblings. Some would yell and try to fight the police, or escape during the ride, but the van was built rock solid to account for those types. Some were child abusers, molesters, remorseless killers who gloated about their sins. Others would beg the police to let them go. I was disgusted by these people, but never disturbed to the point of wanting to quit. After 10 years on the job, nothing fazed me anymore. In fact, I was proud of what I did. The more horrific the person, the more I liked the idea of sending them off to get what they deserved. That was until one day, when a calm, well-groomed young man was apprehended and brought to the van. 4 police officers accompanied him. He was dressed in a tailored blue suit and had shiny brown, slicked-back hair. It couldn't have been older than 30. At first, I mistook him for a manager or lawyer from a distance, before noticing he had both hands behind his back. He nodded politely as he passed my window, and was taken to the back. They unfolded the seats and sat down, and the door was slammed shut. I started the engine.
"This ride's an hour and a bit. You're not going to give us any trouble, are you, son?"
asked one of the officers.
"Of course not. You guys don't get paid nearly enough for that,"
said the man in the suit. A few of the policemen scoffed.
"You're right on that one,"
another officer said, rolling his eyes. My uncle used to be a cop. Ironic, I know. The man in the suit replied nonchalantly, still handcuffed.
"But when he started, there were 50 in his division. Now there's about 10. Makes you wonder if all the tax money is going to nuclear warheads instead." "Wouldn't be surprised,"
one officer mumbled to another, shaking his head.
"My lawyer told me not to say that, because it might piss you off. But I told him you'd all let me go as soon as you heard it."
The policeman guffawed, the entire van erupting with laughter. I wondered what was so funny. Whatever crime he had committed, this man was bantering without a care, while being deported to face life in prison, or possibly the death penalty. He cracked a few more jokes, and they were wrapped around his little finger. A while later, He caught my eye in the rear-view mirror. "You must hear all sorts of crazy stories," said the suited man, talking directly to me. "Imagine being an Uber driver, but all the passengers kill people. I'd watch that reality show." He continued. "Still, it must be satisfying in a weird sort of way, bringing them all to justice. Literally." "Yeah, sick people like you," I replied. He stared at me through the mirror. I felt a chill out of nowhere. My blood ran cold, and I instantly regretted opening my mouth. "Sick people like me?" There was silence for a few seconds. The cops looked at each other awkwardly. I kept quiet. "Well, cheers to you on behalf of all the sick people like me, then," he finally said. I couldn't tell if he was being sarcastic. "I mean it. If it weren't for you, we'd all have to walk to prison. Wouldn't want to drop the soap after that hike." "You must be fun at parties." A cop smirked. I realized the cop was referring to me. They all laughed again. For the rest of the journey, they talked about politics, stories about other prisoners, and how early they could leave for work. They had an odd chemistry with him. The policemen acted very differently to how they usually did. They usually tried to bully the criminals, or scare them into a confession. On the contrary, this time it almost seemed like they were all at a big dinner party, and I wasn't invited. Perhaps they were getting some entertainment while they could, or they were intimidated by him and didn't want to admit it, I thought. Some serial killers were notorious for being charming, after all. Everyone's heard of Ted Bundy. I realized that even after all that chat, I still had no idea what crime he had committed. When we arrived, I opened the back doors for them to get out. "Thanks for the lift. Drive safe." He grinned at me, and they took him away to the prison. The nerve, I thought. I got back in the driver's seat. About a week later, I was in between shifts and decided to take a break at a cafe in the parking lot. I walked inside and joined the queue, eyeing up a big latte. As I glanced to the side, my heart skipped a beat. A man was wearing a blue suit, which looked exactly like the one that criminal with the slick back hair was wearing. I blinked. This man had an afro and was reading a newspaper. Same suit, perhaps, but obviously not the same guy. I exhaled with relief. I ordered my latte and sat down at a table, sipping it slowly. The man in the blue suit sat by the window, still reading the paper. I glanced at him for a while, and noticed that he was just staring into it, without turning the pages. As I stood up to leave, he folded the newspaper and looked up towards me. His lips stretched into a wide, menacing smile, and he dragged his finger across his neck as he stared at me with wide eyes and tilted his head. We stared at each other for a while in silence, my heart starting to race. Then I looked around frantically, suddenly concerned for my safety. Everyone in the cafe was absorbed in their own world. It seemed like no one else had seen the gesture he had made towards me, in a very public space. I rushed out of the cafe, glancing behind me every few steps, suddenly paranoid. He turned his head to lock eye contact with me, gleeful that his threat was having its intended effect on me. For the next few days, I kept hearing noises, footsteps, scratching, sometimes even the sound of someone breathing behind me. When I turned around, there would always be nothing there. Just as I thought I was turning schizophrenic, my suspicion that something was out to get me was confirmed again. I was at the grocery store on the weekend, putting vegetables in my cart, as a woman wearing a blue denim jacket and flowery dress was walking towards me. She was pushing a cart with a baby strapped to the seat. "You better watch your back," she whispered as she walked past. That caught me off guard. I whipped my head around, and she kept walking without looking behind her. She wasn't talking on the phone, and she wasn't with anyone else apart from the baby. That warning was undoubtedly for me. Had I just pissed off a cult of people dressed in blue? I got in the van the next day at 7 a.m. and headed off to the station. There was heavy traffic, and I was convinced I'd be late for work. I turned into a long stretch of road that was next to a steep drop, a metal railing fencing off the edge on the right. As I drove along the congested road, stopping and starting to move a few feet incrementally, I stared at the bumper stickers on the back of the white van in the front. It's gonna be a good day. There was a sun with a smiley face next to it. The traffic finally started flowing, and I approached an intersection where cars merged from the left-hand side. A set of traffic lights came just before it. I looked at my watch. Please don't turn red. Please don't turn red, I thought. As if the universe was conspiring against me, the lights turned yellow, and as the van in front of me sped past them, they turned red. Fantastic. I slammed the brakes and looked up. I only saw the van in front for a split second, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a massive lorry T-boned it violently from the left. A loud crash combined with a painful crunch stunned me into paralysis. Both vehicles crashed through the railings and went hurtling over the edge of the cliff. The lights turned orange, then green, but I remained unmoving in silence, shaking. There was an empty space in front of me where the van had just been. I could see people through their car windows, horrified and calling the police. Eventually, I snapped out of it and drove numbly to a side road without having fully processed the event. I parked there and called my colleagues at the station to inform them about what had just happened. A few days later, I found out that both drivers had died on impact. The lorry had crashed into the van's driver's side at 90 miles per hour, crushing him instantly. They thought it was a freak accident at first, until they recovered the remains and discovered the lorry driver's phone, which had been in a holder stuck to his windshield. It wasn't a GPS on the phone that was guiding him. At the time of the crash, he had been using a navigator app connected to a tracking device. The device had been tracking my vehicle. The police searched my van top to bottom and found the bugger stuck to the underside of one of the back seats. The seat that the man with the slicked-back hair, wearing the blue suit, had sat in on his ride to prison about 2 weeks ago. I pieced it all together as soon as they told me. The motherfucker must have slipped that out from a pocket or something and stuck it to the inside of my van as soon as I pissed him off. Turned out, he was an infamous underground weapons dealer. A lot of people who had their firearms confiscated, most of them for good reason, knew he was their guy that would supply them, so were absolutely infuriated when he got caught. Apparently he had a cult-like following among these people, and wearing all blue was their low-key way of supporting him. I don't want to get too political here, so I'll just say that this guy was very well connected and had a lot of people on his side, even if it was under the radar. And I was their next target. I figured the blue suit guy must have somehow communicated to one of his cronies about the tracking device on my white van and told them to get after me. By pure chance, another white van was in front of me at the very moment they decided to strike. They must have mistaken the driver for me, knowing the vehicle was a white van at that approximate location. If those traffic lights hadn't turned red at that exact moment they did, that would have been me. I was supposed to die a horrific death that day. I quit the job that very afternoon, I found out, packed my bags and moved to a new town. Since then, I've moved several times. The paranoia won't leave me. I think it'll stay with me for the rest of my life. Anytime I see someone wearing blue, a wave of terror sweeps over me. The same terror I felt seeing that van in front of me get pummeled and tumble over the cliff edge, knowing that it should have been me. Previously, I'd always taken pride in the fact that I was a brutally honest guy, but I'm a lot more careful nowadays. And one thing's for sure. When someone makes a lame joke now, I always laugh. I never thought it was weird. It was the same as Dad going to work every day, and Mum cooking dinner every night. Just Matty always ate upstairs. Mum made sure everyone at the table had a full serving before she got to work on Matty's plate. She would load it with super-sized portions of whatever was for dinner, plus leftovers from last night. By the time it was ready, the mountain of food would put Dad's appetite to shame. The night after my 8th birthday, Mum's arms shook, carrying Matty's dinner. She teetered across the kitchen with a serving plate, the one we use for appetizers when we have guests. 3 hamburgers, 2 chicken breasts, egg salad, at least half a dozen corn dogs, and a pile of potatoes. Squeezed next to that were pork chops, meatballs, shrimp fried rice in a Tupperware, and a full mixing bowl of mac and cheese. "Do you need help, honey?" Mum shook her head, finding her balance on the stairs. "Oh, no, Mama's got it. Matty's not feeling well today." "Don't stuff him now." I turned to Dad. Frankly, I was in a bad mood. Matty hadn't wished me a happy birthday yet. In fact, he hadn't come out of his room all day yesterday. He was 2 years older than me, and our sibling rivalry ran deep. Why does Matty need that much food? What if I'm still hungry? Why doesn't he just come down here and eat it? He's a growing boy, you know. Puberty's hitting him. That's a time when every kid undergoes remarkable changes. You'll see. He ignored my other question, so I asked again. Dad put down his fork. Your brother is self-conscious. I know. We've told him it's silly. But we're respecting his decision, giving him time. And you should too. He's your big brother, but he doesn't have one. What he's going through, it can be scary. I crossed my arms. Sounds like a big baby. Enough. His voice cut through me. He spoke through his teeth. Apologize. I mumbled under my breath. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Dad nodded. Mum came down a minute later, and we finished our dinner in silence. In bed, I began to plot a nasty trick. The next day after the bus dropped me off, Mum told me she was going for groceries and to stay in the house in case Matty needed anything. I went up to his room and knocked on the door. Matty? There was no response. Some of my friends from school are coming over today. Do you want to play with us? Again, nothing. I made a face and started down the steps. He wasn't making this easy. Halfway down the stairs, there was a sound from behind his door. Matty? Something dragged a short distance before stopping. I held my breath, straining to hear more. A few seconds passed before I hopped the rest of the way down, confused but eager for my friends to arrive. Mum was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Hunter and Cody got dropped off. They popped out of an SUV Hunter's mum drove and waved, running towards the house. We played for a little in the yard while I explained my plan. Cody looked like he couldn't wait. That doesn't sound very nice, Hunter mumbled. Matty's never nice to me. Remember my birthday party? He didn't even go on the bouncy house. Cody piped up. Yeah, we're not gonna hurt him, Hunter. A few more minutes was all it took to convince him. Then, dinner was ready. Mum tiptoed around the table, dispensing slices of brisket and spoonfuls of pasta with gravy and Italian bread. Cody and Hunter dug in immediately, in a few seconds vaporizing half their plate. I made sure to eat fast too, but kept an eye on Mum. She always put a lot of care into Matty's plate. After she was finished, up she went. When she returned to the kitchen, there was nothing on our plates. Wow, you boys are hungry. Not anymore, I said, patting my stomach. Careful, Dad laughed. If you eat like that, you'll get sick. I crossed my arms and scooted off my chair. Come on, guys. Let's play in my room. All right. Just don't bother Matty while he's eating. We hid our smiles. We made sure our footsteps could be heard from downstairs, walking into my room and loudly closed the door. Then, tiptoeing, we crept out of my room, down the hallway, until we were in front of Matty's door. I'm still hungry. Cody giggled through his hands. Shh. I knocked quietly. "Hello? Matty?" Silence. "Can I come in?" Hunter began pointing insistently, back towards my room. I waved him off. "Matty, it's just me. My friends left." 10 seconds trudged by. Cody looked disappointed. Something hot began to well up in my chest. It wasn't anger. Maybe jealousy? I put my hand on the doorknob. I got A's in all my classes, and Mum and Dad would pat me on their head before mentioning how Matty used to get A pluses. Every day at school, the teachers always asked, "How's Matty doing?" I was the one who loved our dog Archie, the one we had to give away because he never stopped barking at Matty's door. He doesn't play sports. He doesn't have any friends. He doesn't even go to school. He never comes out of his room. He was a good-for-nothing older brother. No, it was hate. I hated Matty. I pushed the door open. Immediately, a vile smell hit our nose, causing Hunter to gag. The curtains were drawn tight around the windows, casting a gloom over the mess inside. Broken toys, shredded notebooks, overturned chairs, and even some broken glass. A cooking program for children played on a small TV, its volume just loud enough to hear over a rickety desk fan.
Who's ready to welcome our guests for this episode?
The fan could only do so much, though. Remains of food stained everything in the room. You couldn't step anywhere to avoid the mold covering the floor. Bits of meat clung to the screen of the television. Red sauce smeared the wall, and there was a huge stain on the sheets of the bed. Hunter tapped my shoulder. "This is gross. I want to go back." "Your brother is nasty," Cody proclaimed. He stepped meticulously into the room, leaving Hunter and I by the door, using the toys like you would stones to cross a river. He jumped onto the bed and recoiled. "Ew, it's wet." "We should leave," Hunter begged.
And what's your name, sweetie?
The TV whispered. I searched the room with my eyes. It was my first time inside in years. I remember when me and Matty used to be inseparable. I may have hated him, but it had been so long since I'd seen him.
I'm Emily.
Cody bounced on a dry part of the bed, laughing.
So, where's the good food?
Hold on, I said. Matty?
Why, Emily, you look good enough to eat.
It was just unfortunate when Matty's accident happened. When I thought about it, I don't think I've actually seen him since that field trip. Mum and Dad would show me recent pictures and videos of him, but I can't tell if he looks older or not. It was partly my fault. I was distracted with all the gifts Mum and Dad got me afterward. They treated me with some of the money they got from the stem cell lab in court. Matty's accident was all their fault, Mum and Dad said. something shifted from the far side of the room. Cody's face lost its color. "Cody, let's go." When his feet hit the ground, a pale hand darted from beneath the bed. Cody tumbled to the floor, shrieking, "Help! Help!" Cody squealed. There was a clattering from the kitchen and footsteps hurrying up the stairs. Hunter ran out of the room wailing. I was glued in place by a morbid fixation. The hand that was clamped tightly around Cody's ankle. Was that Matty's? That thing, impossibly tall, clambering out from underneath the bed. That couldn't be my 10-year-old brother, right? I felt my dad's arms scoop me up and rush me into the hall. Before he shut the door, I could see Mum with her arms raised, in front of a monster. It was holding Cody upside down. Its swollen belly dragged along the floor, as if it had swallowed a boulder. I blacked out. The reason I'm recording this is because I didn't remember Matty until a few days ago. I'm in my 30s now. For the past month, my wife has encouraged me to go to a specialist due to night terrors that began last year. They had started infrequent, but recently it's been every other night that my cries disturb our sleep. I met a woman who put me under some sort of hypnosis to help remember trauma. I woke up with those terrible memories. She told me the event could have been rejected from my memory naturally, due to the severity of it. Or another specialist had induced amnesia on me. I had even forgot about Hunter and Cody. I looked for them both on social media, and was able to get in contact with Hunter. He wasn't very receptive at first, but he agreed to meet after hearing my situation. We sat at a bar. He gulped down his liquor before speaking. My memory is a bit funky too. I was in a mental hospital for a couple of months. We moved, and I learned how to push it away, the memory. In college, I found out it was labeled a kidnapping. What do you mean? Cody never made it out of the house. That I remember. Your parents did a damn good job. I don't know what hoops they jumped through or whose pockets they filled. He paid for his tab. Look, don't contact me again. On the way back to my car, I tried calling my mum. She hasn't answered her phone all day. My dad passed away last year, but my mum still lives at my childhood home. I need to talk with her, in person. And maybe I'll burn that house down on my way out.